Merci beaucoup. Mesdames, Messieurs, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à la conférence de Andrew Yarrow qui nous fait l'honneur d'être là aujourd'hui sur le sujet des élections américaines qui se sont tenues avant-hier et dont nous avons connu le résultat hier. Cette conférence fait partie de 2 cycles de conférences. Un premier cycle qui est le cycle de conférences de professeurs invités, dont Andrew Yarrow est un représentant, qui permettent à un large public, et je me réjouis vraiment très sincèrement de ce nombre de personnes dans l'amphi 1, de profiter des connaissances et des travaux de nos professeurs invités. Le programme de professeurs invités, vous le connaissez sans aucun doute en grande partie, est un programme de Sciences Po Grenoble qui nous permet d'accueillir chaque année une dizaine de professeurs internationaux de différentes disciplines qui sont représentées ici pour donner des cours, donner des conférences et justement participer à ce cycle de conférences. Mais cette conférence fait aussi partie d'un autre cycle qui est celui des analyses électorales qui succèdent généralement aux élections et que nous organisons ici avec le laboratoire de recherche PACT. Donc Sciences Po Grenoble et PACT sont nationalement et internationalement reconnus pour leur analyse électorale. Et ce cycle aujourd'hui débute avec l'échange autour de l'analyse des élections américaines par Andrew Yarrow et se poursuit par une analyse du chercheur Pierre Martin de PACT le 14 novembre, également dans cet amphi. Ces élections ont une immense importance, non seulement pour les États-Unis et les citoyens de ce pays, mais également pour l'Europe et le monde. Je remercie les organisateurs de cette conférence, l'association Colibri Junior Conseil, en plus particulièrement Ariane Dufief, Théophile Didier-Jean et Sidonie Saillard, tout comme la professeure Anne Bartel-Radic, qui est maintenant devant moi, qui est la force invitante de Andrew Yarrow et le service de communication pour l'organisation de cet événement, et bien évidemment Andrew Yarrow pour sa présence. Un très très grand merci. Je vous souhaite une bonne conférence et un bon débat. Merci beaucoup.
Hello everyone, welcome to this conference organized by Sciences Po and Colibri Junior Conseil. Our warmest thanks to Professor Yarrow for his presence and his analysis of this election full of twists and turns. For the past 24 hours, the world has known the 47th President of the United States. Donald Trump has emerged victorious at the end of a fierce campaign whose dynamics needs to be analyzed. This election says a lot about a divided America, whose historic votes are being turned upside down by the Make America Great Again movement. There are many interpretations and analyses to be made, and today we will try to provide some of them. But first, let's introduce our guest, Professor Yarrow. You are a historian and a professor at George Mason University. You were a journalist for the New York Times and a speechwriter in the Clinton administration. Your experience as a consultant to major institutions such as the World Bank, UNICEF, and the US Department of Education make you an obvious choice to help us understand this historic election. Before you begin the intensive process of analyzing and interpreting the results, it's important for our association to ask you a few questions about your background. I'm sure that there are many students in this assembly who are considering similar careers. Perhaps you could give them your opinion and advice.
Well, Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sabine. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone here. Thank you, Sciences Po. It has been a pleasure to be here this fall. And while it may not be such a pleasure to talk about this year's election, I will, and I've been talking about it a lot the last 2 days. I am happy first to talk about my career. So.
Could you briefly summarize your academic background and share some key events from your professional career?
Sure. I had, in some ways, kind of an unconventional academic background. I had majored in history. I had got a PhD in history later in life, but after getting a master's in European history, got a job at the New York Times, age 24, was a reporter there for about 12 years till the mid-1990s. Very interesting time to be in New York City. I decided to make a career change, went to the Harvard Kennedy School for a degree in public administration, and went into the Clinton administration as a speechwriter. Again, a very interesting time, was writing on economic issues for the U.S. Department of Labor for the last 5 years of the Clinton administration, and stayed in the U.S. government, and then worked in a number of think tanks in Washington, the Brookings Institution, the Aspen Institute, some other think tanks as well. And during that time, actually, I finished my PhD in American history, switched from European to American history. But throughout this time, I continued to write, and I've written 6 books. My most recent book published just, 3 years ago, not quite 3 years ago. And I also started, while I had been a news and feature reporter at the New York Times, I started writing opinion pieces on a freelance basis for a lot of American newspapers, opinion pieces about politics, about social change, about social issues in America. And during this time as well, I taught at American University in Washington, D.C., where I live, and more recently, in the last few years, at George Mason University. So that's been kind of the twists and turns of my career.
Thank you so much. As a former journalist at the New York Times, how do you analyze the role of American media, traditional media, such as the press, but also social media in this campaign?
Oh, that's such a huge topic, Ariane. I mean, I've always been an admirer of traditional media, of good journalism, print media in particular, but certainly some television media. I think, as we all know, the internet has brought a lot of havoc with particularly newspapers and magazines in America, throughout the world. I think more in America than in France or in Western Europe, but still here as well. I think social media has been a very mixed blessing for the world. It has enabled anyone with any idea, any inspiration to be their own journalist, to go out and report, to spout their opinions. And in one sense, one could say that democratizes the media. I think of when I worked at the New York Times, we were on West 43rd Street in Manhattan, and pretty much all of the media that dominated America, Time Magazine, Time Life, Newsweek, the 3 television networks, were all within a 10-block area, 15-block area of Midtown Manhattan, and largely controlled by white men, liberal white men, but white men nonetheless. Okay, So social media democratizes this. All sorts of people can express their opinions. On the other hand, people who worked for CBS, who worked for the New York Times, who worked for Newsweek and Time, were professionals, had ethics about what they reported on. There were editors who vetted what they wrote about, who fact-checked, which is not the case with social media. So very, very mixed feelings about social media.
Thank you very much. And so now that we have the results, how do you feel about the outcome of this election?
Oh, huge topic. I'm sure there are not too many Donald Trump supporters in this audience. If there are, that's okay. But I'm not a Trump supporter. I've been a Democrat all my life. I'm not all that surprised by the results. I'm surprised by the scale of Donald Trump's victory. I felt that the momentum had been moving toward Donald Trump in the last weeks, really the last month and a half of the election, and moving away from Kamala Harris. I think we'll spend a lot of time talking about why that happened. But yes, it was a surprise how much that Donald Trump won by such a large, an absolute majority. He did not win the popular vote in 2016 or 2020. The vote shifted from 4.5–5 percentage point victory by Joe Biden in 2020 to what seems like a 3 to 4 percentage point victory for Donald Trump this year. That's a huge shift given how divided America is. And when you think about the 7 or 8 percentage points, we're talking about 12, 14 million Americans. Who are these people who shifted? And who are these people who shifted? I mean, we saw the polls showing Kamala Harris ahead in even the last days of the campaign. Again, I was skeptical of those polls, but to see that Trump won by the margin he did, yes, was a surprise.
Did the support from public figures, such as Taylor Swift for Kamala Harris or Elon Musk for Donald Trump, influence the election results?
Well, it doesn't seem like Taylor Swift, despite her huge popularity, swung a lot of votes. As far as Elon Musk, I must confess, about a year and a half ago, I bought a Tesla. I start to regret that. That Elon Musk, it really went a bit off the deep end. I don't know who he appealed to, but I did a little conference with Anne a few weeks ago about masculinity in America based on a book that I had written that was published in 2018 called Man Out, Men on the Sidelines of American Life. And basically a book about the problems that many American men, certainly not all, but many American men have and cause. Problems they have in terms of being out of work, having downward mobility, having poor health, having poor mental health, high alcohol, drug abuse, suicide rates relative to women, but problems they cause too in terms of misogyny, sexual harassment, sexual violence, and the violence in America. I mean, 90% of America's 2 million prisoners are men, prisoners and people in jail, prisons and jails. So the issue of getting to Elon Musk, a long way of answering about Elon Musk. Elon Musk certainly appealed to this notion of men feeling victimized, feeling on the outs, many American men feeling like they had been overtaken by women. In American higher education, 60% of college students are now women. So there's a sense, and a lot of American men not accustomed to seeing women as their bosses or to seeing their wives or girlfriends or partners making more money than they do. And certainly there's been a backlash building for a number of years in America, really much of this century, the end of the last century. And you look at the so-called gender gap, the gender voting gap in America. Before Ronald Reagan, men were more liberal, more progressive than women. Men were more likely to vote Democratic from the time women got the vote in America in 1920 until the Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. That started to shift. And what does that correlate with? That correlates with downward fortunes of a lot of less educated men, precisely the constituency that was so important for Donald Trump. And what we saw in his past two campaigns appealing to a lot of downwardly mobile, lower middle class, working class white men. The big change in this election, as we've seen with Hispanic men, the shift of 16 percentage points among Hispanic points. I believe that was the number toward Donald Trump. There was the belief that African-American men might shift more to Trump. There were polls in America before the election showing bigger shifts. The last numbers I saw were only about a 2 percentage point shift, I believe, in African-American men. But still, this notion with Elon Musk, with some of Trump's other supporters, of appealing to this kind of aggrieved masculinity in America. So I think in that sense, in a very long-winded way, that Elon Musk and some other figures did have an influence in the campaign for Trump.
Do you think that, how will these election results impact the future policies that will be implemented in the US?
Oh, gosh. That is a huge question and hard to know. We certainly the big issues that Donald Trump talked about during the campaign and has talked about just in the couple of days since the election, immigration, the economy, those will be big areas. Trump has talked about deporting immigrants, shutting the door to immigrants. Certainly immigration is a huge issue in the United States for a lot of Americans. This notion that Trump put out there that immigrants were taking Americans' jobs, a part of his appeal to some African Americans, where he was taking so-called black jobs, kind of a crazy notion that Trump put out during the campaign. But, there is a lot of fear of immigrants in America, as I know there is in big sectors of France and Germany, throughout Western Europe. You see this particularly in border states, in states like Texas, Arizona, to some extent California, this sense that immigrants are taking over the country. So he's clearly going to do something, whether he actually starts deporting immigrants in large numbers. The idea of deporting, if he means what he says, and you never know with Donald Trump, if he means millions of people, it would be a human rights disaster to have this happen. Even if he starts deporting selected few, this would be awful. It would be awful symbolism. But he probably will also put money back into his, for a time, ill-fated wall along the Mexican border. But in terms of other policies, he's talked a lot about imposing tariffs on imported goods, and being one of his first actions, 10% tariffs on goods from France and Europe and all the world, 60% from China. He has said, and at the same time talking about cutting taxes. Well, the U.S. has not supported its government through revenues for a long, long time, but certainly not for tariffs in the last century. Our revenues come from taxes and come from borrowing. And the notion that somehow he could cut taxes and raise revenues and keep the economy going, the American economy actually did pretty well under Joe Biden, despite what he said. Joe Biden brought inflation down, and we can talk about, the fears of inflation in America, and they were real. But Joe Biden brought inflation down. There were a lot of job creation under Biden. Yes, there's a lot of economic inequality in America that long predated Joe Biden. But in terms of Trump, yeah, tariffs are going to hurt Americans if he does impose them. They will impose an indirect tax, a consumption tax on really all Americans. We buy goods from Europe, we buy goods from China, from Japan. But in terms of other policies, with a Republican-controlled Senate and probably the House of Representatives, he will have free rein to do a lot of things, to roll back some of the historic climate action policies, the environmental policies that were passed during the Biden administration. The talk of drilling for more oil will probably happen. That he will probably pull out of the Paris Accords for good. What will happen in terms of foreign policy? You saw the rejoicing in countries like Israel, like Hungary, over the election. Of course, the Israel-Gaza conflict is a complicated one, a very complicated one, and I think Joe Biden did quite a good job in navigating an impossible task. Israel was attacked by terrorists, but Israel has now way overplayed its hand in Gaza. And so what will Trump do? Probably give Israel and the Netanyahu government free rein, which I think will be a disaster. We need peace in the Middle East. We need a Palestinian state. And as far as Ukraine, it's interesting that Zelensky sent his congratulations early on to Trump. Trump has certainly been no friend of Zelensky going back to 2017 when he wanted Zelensky to go after Biden and Hillary Clinton. But the notion that he could end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, I doubt it. We seriously doubt that. But other policies in America, I think he's talked about getting rid of the Department of Education, of going after his enemies in America, of rolling back big parts of the welfare state, of putting loyalty, in essence, loyalty tests on the civil service in government, going after people he considers enemies who are career employees of the government. Whether he can actually do this, I kind of doubt it, but, many people kind of doubted in 2015 that he would ever even be elected president. Probably most of you are not old enough to remember an episode of The Simpsons from 25 years ago when in The Simpsons there was a joke about Donald Trump becoming president of the United States. If you don't know that episode, look it up. Donald Trump was considered a joke in America until 2015, even in the Republican Party. So my point in saying that is not to underestimate what he might do in these next 4 years.
As we all know, American political life has been marked by violence in the past, like we saw a few years ago with the Capitol, for example. And during this campaign, this took the form of invective and even two attempt murders against Donald Trump. So how has this impacted the election?
Well, I mean, America's a violent country. You know, since being here in Grenoble, I've had people tell me that Grenoble has a lot of crime. It doesn't compared to the United States. Yeah, we are a violent country. Trump was also supported by the gun lobby, by the National Rifle Association. Kamala Harris and the Democrats have long made gun control, and Joe Biden made gun control a major policy priority. That's not going to happen with Trump. Again, sort of appealing to this tough guy masculinity image that guns have come to symbolize in America. But whether there will be political violence, that's hard to say. I mean, the political violence in 2021 was, of course, coming from Trump supporters. Trump will be in office. It's possible there could be attacks on Trump. I mean, it's terrible that people did try to kill him twice during this campaign. And, you know, there are a lot of people with guns in America. There are more guns than adults in America. There may be more guns than people in America. So, you know, something could happen, but, you know, I certainly hope it doesn't.
Now, if you want to talk a bit more about Donald Trump's program, do you consider it to be illiberal? And do you share the view of some American political actors who consider that some of the former president's proposals share common characteristics with fascism?
Big question there. It's interesting how, you know, the fascism word started to be bandied about in the last weeks of the campaign. And it's interesting how Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, even spoke of Trump having fascist tendencies. Noted historian of Vichy France in America talked about Trump having fascist tendencies. A number of Democrats have used that term. You know, what does fascism really mean in 2024? That's a tough question. I mean, certainly Trump has authoritarian tendencies, very strong authoritarian tendencies. I mean, one can debate the meanings of fascism historically from the 1920s and 1930s. I don't think Donald Trump is going to start rounding up people, though you never know, but I doubt that. I think there are still more than enough checks in America, in our courts, despite his packing the U.S. Supreme Court and the possibility of further packing the federal judiciary with appointments that he'll be able to get through the Senate. But I think our courts are strong enough, and even the American military has shown that Donald Trump didn't get in his first term, that the military didn't report to him personally. It pledged allegiance to the Constitution, to defend the Constitution of the United States and the people of the United States. And so I don't think, I think there are checks on the more extreme tendencies, but, you know, certainly Trump is part of a wave, a far-right wave that we've seen in Europe, we've seen in America, we've seen elsewhere in the world, Narendra Modi in India, I see with Netanyahu in Israel, seen with Orban, see here with Marine Le Pen, have seen with the AfD in Germany, with Giorgia Meloni in Italy. And, you know, he will have those people as his friends. I mean, there were people like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who is thankfully out of power. But, you know, he's part of really a right-wing international. Whether one can call him a fascist, I think that's a tricky thing to answer.
Now, what can you say about the Democrats' campaign? What do you think were the mistakes made by the Harris camp?
Again, another huge question, and people will be, analyzing this for days, weeks, really years to come. I mean, historians will be talking about this election for years. What we're doing now is, what we call in America Monday morning quarterbacking. What went wrong? What went wrong with the plays? An American football term. Well, first off, Joe Biden is a decent man, a good man, a decent president, but the fact that he clearly wasn't and hasn't been well. I saw just before coming on tonight that apparently he's going to be giving some remarks. I don't know if it's today or in the next few days about this election. But the fact that Biden had to drop out in July because of his disastrous debate performance with Trump in June certainly made it difficult for the Democrats, for Kamala Harris. The fact that the Democrats coalesced around Kamala Harris so quickly, was in Paris yesterday and talking on TV there about the election and was saying, there was kind of a sugar high, another American expression, that people were excited about Kamala Harris after she became a candidate at the Democratic convention. It seemed like this wonderfully choreographed convention that the Democrats had in Chicago. All the great stars of the Democratic Party were there. Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Oprah Winfrey. I mean, you can run down the list of Democratic stars, Hollywood people. And it seemed like everything was going Kamala Harris's way. But when you think about it, she had very little time to campaign. She had 17 or 18 weeks to campaign. Not much by American standards. And she was not well known by many of the American people. She had really been kept kind of in the background by the Biden administration, which may have been a mistake by Biden and by others in the administration to keep her in the background. But vice presidents have a history of being in the background, so you can't really blame Joe Biden or his administration entirely for that. And in terms of her campaign, Donald Trump and the Republicans made a big deal about how she'd shifted positions on a lot of issues. And yes, that could be held against her. She was seen when she campaigned for president in 2020 against Joe Biden in the primaries. She was more of a left-wing candidate, and she tacked to the center, became more of a centrist in this election. There were positions like she opposed fracking, fracking for oil, shale oil, in 2020. And now in this election, she said she supported fracking. Her positions on Israel and Gaza sort of shifted a bit. Again, she had a hard road to navigate on Israel and Gaza, but she did shift. It wasn't clear really what the positions were, I think, to a lot of Americans that she stood for. The Democrats had been the party of more open immigration and of freer trade, which of course historically wasn't true. The Republicans decades ago had been more the party of free trade in America. But in recent years, recent decades, the Democrats had been the party of free trade. But she started to go against, take the popular view of kind of attacking China. China is an easy sort of bogeyman in America and in Europe too. That the Chinese are stealing our jobs or taking our economy. So Harris moved, she shifted positions on a lot of things. Not that politicians don't do that all the time, all over the world, but maybe it became unclear to many Americans what she stood for, and on some policies, was she really that different from Donald Trump in policies? Policies like trade, perhaps. Policies like the Middle East, perhaps. Yes, somewhat she talked about the problems with immigration. No, she wasn't going to deport people. Yes, on issues like abortion and women's reproductive rights, very different, different from Donald Trump. But, where else might the Democrats have gone wrong? I'm a big supporter of LGBTQ rights in America and around the world, but maybe the Democrats, they got tarred by being too woke, too kind of enthralled to the LGBT community, perhaps also with Black Lives Matter after the George Floyd murder. There was a lot of support and rightfully support for, concern, I should say, for, why is there police violence against African American men, which has been going on for generations in America. But there started to be backlash in America on that too. The notion, in the neighborhood where I live, a very democratic neighborhood, you would see lots of white people with signs, Black Lives Matter, out on their lawns, and, LGBTQ signs out on their lawns. And, something you don't see in France, yard signs, I don't think, maybe a strange American tradition. But I think this notion that the Democrats were maybe a little bit too enthralled to sort of a woke agenda, maybe hurt Harris and the Democrats somewhat. What else? I could argue with her choice of a vice presidential running mate. I think Tim Walz is a good man, a good governor. One might wonder, had she picked Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, would Pennsylvania have gone differently in this election? Would other states? Maybe not. Maybe Trump still would have won the other swing states. Again, one can do a lot of second guessing. At the first debate with Donald Trump, which she pretty clearly won, Trump did not want to debate again. Should Harris have pushed him at that debate to debate again? She didn't. She didn't challenge him really to another debate. Maybe that would have made him look more cowardly, not the tough guy that he presented himself as. Also, sadly, I think Donald Trump, for all his many, many flaws, is a charismatic figure, which charismatic, and there are a lot of evil figures who are charismatic, but Kamala Harris was not terribly charismatic. She's not a wonderful speaker. She's okay as a speaker. So should the Democrats have considered other candidates back in July? Some people thought so. I've heard that Bernie Sanders in the last hours has talked about the Democrats making a big mistake. I haven't heard all of his remarks. So, maybe Kamala Harris made mistakes. Maybe the Democratic Party made mistakes. But, it's easy to sit here 3,500 miles away and second guess a campaign. I mean, in many ways, she did a good job, but obviously not good enough.
Thank you so much. In terms of foreign policy, you talked about it already a little bit, but we would like to ask you a bit furthermore. What will be the consequences for Europe, more precisely?
Well, yeah, a great question. I mean, Trump infamously said during the campaign, he's made a big deal of Europeans not paying their full amount for NATO, and infamously said during the campaign that Putin, that the Russians could do what they want. You know, an awful comment. You know, you begin to wonder what Vladimir Putin has on Donald Trump, that he's so enthralled to Vladimir Putin. It's hard to imagine Americans moving away from Europe. I mean, Europe is so much of our history. As you know, France is our oldest ally, who helped America during the Revolution against the British. But there's also a strong isolationist tendency in America, and there's been that kind of tendency that's run in and out of American history. The tendency to pull back to our own borders, that, you know, his whole slogan, America First, which was really a far-right slogan back in the 1930s. It was kind of a proto-Nazi slogan in the 1930s in America. The idea that we really don't need to care about the rest of the world. You know, America certainly has made lots of mistakes in its history, lots of mistakes, particularly in my lifetime during the Cold War, in Vietnam and Latin America and Africa, throughout the world. But the United States has also done a lot of good in the world. The United States helped Europe win World War II. The United States helped preserve peace in the world, in much of the world, helped defeat the Soviet Union. Again, I was no fan of Ronald Reagan's, but certainly no fan of the communists either. And of course, NATO was formed as an alliance to defend Europe against the communist, the Soviet threat. The idea of pulling back from NATO would be a disaster. I certainly hope he wouldn't do that. And in terms of the rest of the world, I mean, China's dangerous these days. Dangerous more economically, more dangerous domestically in China in terms of its human rights. I don't think China wants to provoke war with the world, despite all the rhetoric about Taiwan. I think China is too concerned about making money, about selling its goods to the world. I think, you know, China's economy has been suffering. I think Xi Jinping has become more dictatorial in China than prior Chinese leaders. And I think, but his legitimacy, the Communist Party's legitimacy in China, is dependent on prosperity for the Chinese people. And so I don't think China wants a war with the United States, and the rhetoric coming out of Washington about the kind of bellicose, the hostile rhetoric toward China doesn't help. In terms of the rest of the world, I think Donald Trump probably doesn't care a bit about Latin America or Africa. In terms of Western Europe, I remember when he came to France, I think in 2018, and Emmanuel Macron took him up the Eiffel Tower and showed him some French jets flying around Paris. You know, that appealed to his sensibility. I see European leaders already kind of bowing and scraping, Macron, von der Leyen, Zelensky as well, the British, the Germans. If the Europeans try to appeal to his vanity in the way that Macron tried to in 2018, maybe he will kind of back down on his threats to pull out of NATO. But I think it's definitely a dangerous time ahead for foreign policy and for America.
All right, thank you so much. Now we would like to take questions from the audience because we're here to debate, of course. There will be two persons with the mics and so you can just raise your hand and we'll let you speak if you guys want.
S'il y a des personnes qui veulent poser la question en français, c'est possible. Oui.
Je vais repasser en français. S'il y a des personnes qui se sentent plus à l'aise pour poser la question en français, c'est possible et on traduira après.
That's a question. Yeah, I see that. Wow. Okay. What time is it? Do we have?
It's 30 minutes.
Yeah, but just we have.
Ok. Samia, tu peux me tenir mon... C'est bon, les 16. Voilà, ouais. C'est tout. C'est bon, je peux y aller? Hello, and thank you for your presence and the knowledge you brought to us throughout this conference. As we have all seen and felt, no one would have thought that Donald Trump would have really won with a majority of the votes, especially with regard to the huge mistakes he made during his mandate. We mostly tended to think that Kamala Harris had every chance against Trump and that a return to power of the Republican in the White House was almost unacceptable. As a result, my question is, how would you describe Trump's electoral strategy compared to Kamala Harris?
Great question. I mean, I think a lot of his electoral strategy was really appealing to his base, appealing to the groups who supported him solidly for the last 8-9 years, which is heavily the less educated Americans without college degrees, rural and small town Americans, to some extent older Americans, though that did change a little bit with this election, working class Americans. But beyond that base, I mean, Trump has held on to about 40% of the American electorate pretty solidly from 2016 on down. So how did he get above 50% in this election? Well, he expanded that base, and he did that in part by appealing to non-traditional groups, particularly people of color, Hispanics, particularly. We talked about his appeal to men, this kind of sexist, misogynistic appeal to many American men, and playing on the sense of grievance that maybe women had gone too far in America, or the LGBTQ community had gone too far in America. And so I think for a lot of you see the big shift with Hispanic men and Hispanic women too. Hispanic women moved 7 percentage points toward Trump from what they voted for Joe Biden in 2020. So some of this appealing to perhaps more traditional values, traditional conservative values, but also, I mean, there was a lot of rhetoric around God. I mean, Donald Trump is hardly the most religious man. You'd hardly think of him as, the picture of piety. You saw during this campaign, Donald Trump started to sell Bibles. I mean, kind of crazy. Bibles are given out free in America and most parts of the world. Only Donald Trump, who, had his own airline that failed, had his own university that failed, had casinos that failed, would try to sell Bibles. But, appealing to, he always had a base with evangelical Christians in America, but this kind of growth of Christian nationalism, of linking Christianity with American power, American greatness, I think that drew in some more people and probably drew in, some of that growing Hispanic American population. For Harris, I think she perhaps concentrated too much on women, on young people. She didn't win young people. I mean, she won young people, but by a much smaller margin than Joe Biden won them, which is interesting. Joe Biden, an older candidate, an older white man, did better among young, not only young men, but young women in America. 18 to 29-year-olds moved toward Donald Trump. Why that happened is, I think, a really interesting thing to try to understand. Some of that is about, this masculinity, but not all. So, he was able to expand his base with Hispanics, with younger people, a small extent among African Americans. Harris was unsuccessful in really broadening the base that Democrats had with Joe Biden, which was surprising. I remember shortly after the Democratic convention, there was an online event that I joined called White Dudes for Harris. And it seemed like this big deal. Hundreds of thousands of white men were online supporting Kamala Harris. Okay, this seemed like something. And what Joe Biden did in 2020 was move the white male vote, some of that white male vote that had gone for Trump in 2016, moved back to the Democrats. It seemed like Kamala Harris was trying to do something with white men, but she failed with white men. She lost white men compared, she lost white men, period, but her percentage with white men went down compared to Joe Biden in 2020. So, what was the role of sexism, of racism in this campaign? Did people vote against her because she was some people, because she was a woman, or vote against her because she was a person of color? Hard to say. Probably, but hard to say. Lots of other questions. I know there are lots of questions. I'll try to be shorter.
Hello?
Yes, no.
So we saw the Democrats move more towards the center and almost a little bit right on a lot of things during this election. Do you think when the next round comes around, they're going to continue to move further right, or they're going to try to do a more left-wing election and policies to see what happens?
Well, that's a great question. And, that gets to what Bernie Sanders has been saying, that Democrats really abandoned their traditional constituency of the working class, of workers in America. And, who would be that candidate to win back workers? A pro-worker Democrat who I like, Sherrod Brown, was defeated in Ohio. I think Bernie Sanders will be too old. I think Elizabeth Warren will be too old and too many negatives about her. It's hard to say. I think Kamala Harris is history. It's will the Democrats move? I think the Democrats will be very divided going forward. There will be some pushing for the Democrats to move left, some thinking that the Democrats should try to reclaim the center. but who can do that? There's some Democratic governors out there, like Josh Shapiro or Andy Beshear in Kentucky, who's more centrist, who was won in a Republican state, a Democrat. Maybe that's the way Democrats will go, but hard to say.
Professor Andrew Yarrow, I can voice to all of the crowd that we very much appreciate your presence here at Sciences Po, coming from such a long area. Me, as a Middle Eastern, very much influenced by Edward Said, Professor Mersheimer, and Noam Chomsky, would like to question the Orientalist aspect. How would you believe that the foreign policy from Donald Trump would even differentiate between Joe Biden, as personally I would disagree that Joe Biden has done a good deal with the question of Palestine? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you're saying that Joe Biden did do some positive things for Palestine or not?
Regarding the first initial quarter, from October the 7th till the February, there was three main, with Qatar, there was three main ceasefire in which it was effective for the prisoners being able to go back to Israel and vice versa for the Palestinians. But then afterwards, when Khan Yunis and South Gaza had been with no humanitarian aid, the UN reported with Amnesty International that over 400,000 people are starving in October alone. And now, during this 24 hours, over 50 individuals died in Lebanon. So, as I agree very much with what you said, Professor, that Donald Trump will be able to give free rein to Netanyahu now. So how would you see the retrospect in the future?
Yeah, I'm afraid that Trump will give free rein to Netanyahu. And I think Netanyahu is, we probably all know, is most concerned with holding on to his own power. There are clearly lots of Israelis who are unhappy with Netanyahu for all sorts of reasons. His constitutional reforms, his prosecution of this war, the bad intelligence, the implicit deals he even made with Hamas over the years. But Netanyahu has every motivation to keep this war going, and I think Donald Trump will be happy to fuel that. On the other hand, Trump talks a big game about being a peacemaker. He talked in his speech the other night that there were no wars when he was president. Of course, there still was the Afghanistan war, but we don't have to go there. But I think there will be some pressure there will be pressure to do something to end this war. There can't just be the continued devastation in Palestine. And it's hurting Israel. It's hurt Israel's reputation in the world. But 45,000 dead Palestinians, the attacks on the West Bank, the attacks in Lebanon, certainly there are a lot of evil actions taken by Hamas. The attacks of October 7 were horrendous. But, to keep this war going and the starvation in Palestine, is untenable. Can Donald Trump look away from that? He's not the most compassionate man. On the other hand, he is sensitive to what people think about him. And, maybe that will sway him. The idea that he could be a peacemaker, he could be win a Nobel Peace Prize, crazy as that sounds, maybe that would motivate him going to Oslo. if he even knows where the Peace Prize is given out. But, yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for coming. I have few questions. So my first question is about women, because you mentioned in speech that 77% Hispanic women shifted to voting Trump. And I saw in New York Times and CNN's photo that many women celebrating Trump's victory. So what you think that where Kamala Harris failed to attract the women voters? This is my first question.
Mm-hmm.
I have few questions.
Okay.
Sorry. I also saw some data. So there I saw that generally Hispanic, Arab, and Indian peoples voted for the Democrats. But in this election, we can see that in the swing states, Donald Trump literally winner in all the swing states, and the Arab, Hispanic people voted for Donald Trump. So what are the reasons for that? And I have, I have another question that Donald Trump is the maybe the first person who is a convicted felon, right? So we can see that the uprising of populism, nationalism, you can see it in India, Narendra Modi, and in Italy. So, and after victory of Donald Trump, I see in Twitter that the very first moment, Narendra Modi congratulated him, my heartiest friend. So, what do you think? India is like a kind of enemy with China in the Indo-Pacific. So, what do you think that what will be the situation in the Indo-Pacific after Donald Trump's victory? Because Narendra Modi and Trump is very close. So these are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, a lot of questions there to remember. Well, starting with women, Donald Trump has won white women, the white female vote in every election he's run in. The women swinging to the Democrats has largely been because of African American women. Some younger white women, yes, but older white women have supported Trump, have been majority Trump, since 2016. Why do they support him? I mean, there are a lot of traditionalist women in America, a lot of women who, are not kind of from coastal elites, from the New Yorks and Californias of America, who see that the idea of women's principal role being a mother, being a homemaker, is still what their role should be. I mean, less educated women in America. Trump held on to the white, big chunk of the white female vote, but with Hispanic women, yes, there was a 7 percentage point shift, not as big as the 16 percentage point shift among Hispanic men, but I think some of this was appealing to a kind of cultural conservatism, whether it's about abortion, about women's rights, the strength of Catholicism among many Hispanics in America probably played a role among some Hispanic women. As far as your, your third question was about Narendra Modi, and as I've suggested earlier, I think Narendra Modi is kind of cut from the same cloth as Donald Trump. you know, there was the question about fascism earlier. I think Modi has been a very dangerous figure. Modi is somebody who's played up ethnic and religious differences, as you know, Hindu nationalism in India, attacks on Muslims, something that, of course, Donald Trump attacked Muslims in his first actions as president the first time around in 2017, barring immigrants from several Muslim countries to come to America. I mean, those bans were rescinded, but yeah, I think the fact that India is an enemy of China's, historic enemy of China's. I mean, Joe Biden tried to play both sides there. Went to see Modi, but clearly most people in the Democratic Party were not big fans of Modi and the anti-Muslim policies of the Modi government. But the fact that, you know, China is seen as at least our economic, if not geopolitical enemy, yeah, Trump will play that up. I'm sure there will be, you know, he will invite Narendra Modi to the White House. He will go to India, make a big deal of that. And let's see, your other question was, your second question, I'm sorry. Oh, a convicted felon. Yeah, well, Americans clearly looked past the fact that he was a convicted felon. I mean, what's scary, too, is, you know, his two other trials were delayed during this election by courts that were friendly to him. Trump will no doubt dismiss the special counsel, Jack Smith. Those trials, those investigations will be squashed. They won't go forward. There won't be more felony counts. There won't be more indictments. So, I mean, justice won't be done in America. And the fact that he was a convicted felon, twice impeached, clearly didn't matter to a lot of Americans.
Hello, and thank you so much for sharing your ideas. My question is, to what extent do you think the fact that Kamala Harris is a woman has impacted the way she was able to get people to vote for her? And also, given that it's the second time Donald Trump wins over a woman, do you think it may reveal that maybe America is not ready yet to have a female president?
Well, thank you for that question. That's a very, very powerful question because, yeah, it's scary to think that the two women who have been nominated by a major party, by the Democratic Party, to run for president, have both been defeated by one man, Donald Trump, somebody who is a misogynist, a sexual offender, philanderer, all sorts of things, clearly not supportive of women's rights. He's talked of taking care of women as if, you know, women are pets to be taken care of. Yeah, it's troubling. It's very troubling. Does that mean the Democrats will not nominate a woman in the future? I kind of think they won't in 2028 after this. And it's a funny thing. There was, for another book that I wrote about a magazine in American life, Look magazine, that went out of business in 1971. Gloria Steinem, the famous feminist still alive in America in her early 90s, wrote in Look magazine in 1970 America needs a woman president in 1976. That was nearly 50 years ago. It hasn't happened. In 1972, Shirley Chisholm, an African-American congresswoman from Brooklyn, from New York, ran briefly for the presidency. She knew she wasn't going to win. The last time I was in New York, just in early September, I saw and was very pleased to see there's a Shirley Chisholm Park in Brooklyn now. If you ever get to Brooklyn, look for that. She was the first woman to run for president on a major party, not as a candidate, not as the nominee, but yeah, the experience of Hillary Clinton and now Kamala Harris, I think, is going to make the Democrats shy about having a woman candidate. And you think the first woman who was a vice presidential candidate, Geraldine Ferraro, in 1984, who ran with Walter Mondale against Ronald Reagan. She was trashed by Ronald Reagan's vice presidential candidate, George H.W. Bush, and his wife. They made fun of her as a woman. Maybe America isn't ready, despite what Gloria Steinem wrote 54 years ago.
Okay, so thanks for your conference. Okay. So we don't talk much about the participation, so we don't have all the results yet, but do you think abstentionism could have played like a key role in the outcomes, especially like expressing a frustration against the Democrats?
It's hard to know. As you say, we don't have the results. It seemed, as it always seems in elections, that turnout was heavy, but I haven't heard what the final participation numbers are, so it's hard to say. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Hello. Hi, everyone. I have a question about the hot topic, means abortion. So, and maybe you know where I'm going. So 1 week ago, there was an article who was published about a woman who died after being denied miscarriage. And, I'm really an advocate for women's rights and everything. And you see Donald Trump talking about we have to protect women, we have to help them in every kind of form. And you see them, the Republicans, talking about we have to get justice about the kids and the babies who were aborted, but how are we going to have justice for babies when we don't think about women? So this is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, clearly it seemed like abortion rights after Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court, by the 3 justices who Trump appointed in his first term, was going to be a big motivator for people. In the 2022 midterm elections, it seemed to bring out a lot of people to vote for Democratic candidates, to vote for abortion rights measures in states, even in Republican states around the country. But it clearly didn't seem to make the kind of difference for Kamala Harris that perhaps many Democrats and Democratic strategists were hoping. Abortion was a difficult issue for Donald Trump. He kind of waffled on the issue. There were many far-right Republicans who wanted a national abortion ban. Trump, after kind of dancing with that position, talked about leaving it up to the states. And leaving it up to the states basically means that red states as has happened, will ban abortion and blue states will allow abortion. So it makes it very difficult and dangerous for women in red states if they can't get to a blue state for an abortion. So, I mean, I know here in France, I think abortion rights has been enshrined into the Constitution, which is, I think, a big deal. And in many ways, I think, a response to what happened in America, to the Roe v. Wade overturning. But, you know, it won't be a pretty picture for abortion rights for women in America, particularly in red states. The idea that Kamala Harris campaigned on to try to enshrine abortion rights is clearly not going to happen. Now, the fact that Trump says leave it to the states will mean that there will be states, blue states, where abortion will be legal, where women will have the right to choose, but there will be many other states where they won't have the right. So another way in which America will remain a very divided country going forward.
Thank you so much for being here. My question is in relation to the Republican Party. And because I remember when Trump lost the election, actually the Republican Party was very divided in terms of having him as a candidate. Mm-hmm. And then as well, if we look into the profile of the vice president, which is Vance, is like a man who studied a lot, has a great career, and was actually anti-Trump. And now he turned his head to be vice president. Therefore, my question is, what is actually the scope of action of Trump? If we talk about the Senate or House of Representatives, will the party block some things? And as well, can we see maybe when Trump is going to stop running as president and maybe Vance will be the candidate, a healthier relation between the Democrats and the Republicans, which was maybe more present before, but now is very extremist. And as you mentioned before, we see also the Democrats have been very woke this time. So how does these tendencies within the Republicans can influence the next steps ahead? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, the Republicans, it's very true, were divided after Trump lost in 2020. I mean, you had a number of candidates, I mean, like Ron DeSantis in Florida, others, Chris Christie, who tried to steer the Republican Party in other directions. I think Ron DeSantis was, in terms of policy, as bad as Donald Trump, but perhaps not quite as crazy as Donald Trump. But Donald Trump has clearly captured the Republican Party. The fact that, as you say, J.D. Vance did a about-face, you know, it's sort of like what happened in Stalinist Russia. People were forced to confess their sins and come over to the side of, you know, the great leader, Joe Stalin, Donald Trump. I mean, the comparisons there. J.D. Vance now is firmly a Trumpist. I think I mean, it's hard to predict what the next 4 years will bring, but right now he's probably would be the candidate of the Republican Party in 2028. I mean, a lot of things could go wrong for the Republicans, could go wrong for America. But it's hard to see a more moderate wing of the Republican Party coming back. You know, you go back a long ways in American history to the era of Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. There were a lot of moderate Republicans. There were even liberal Republicans in the 1960s. George Romney of Michigan, Mitt Romney's father, John Lindsay of New York, Nelson Rockefeller of New York. Republicans in the Senate in the 1960s helped Lyndon Johnson pass civil rights legislation. That Republican Party is gone. So can it come back? You know, it's strange when a figure like Liz Cheney becomes a hero to the left in America. Liz Cheney's a very conservative woman, but at least she's a principled woman. She stood for the rule of law. And what did Donald Trump say about her? She should be shot. You know, just a week or so ago. It's, I mean, in essence, said she should be shot. So, I mean, will there be a more moderate wing of the Republican Party to challenge Trump? Certainly don't see it in the near future.
Last question, maybe.
Good evening. Thank you for this interesting conference. My question was about Trump's international trade policy. And we have seen in Joe Biden's mandate that the U.S. were blocking the judge nominee at the WHO despot settlements body. And Donald Trump was intending to withdraw from WHO. So do you think he will do it? And like globally, what will change in the U.S. international trade policy with the Trump's mandates? Thank you.
Well, thank you. That brings up a very important fact of COVID, which a lot of Americans seem to have forgotten, that the worst of the COVID pandemic happened under Donald Trump. He talked about injecting chlorine at first. I mean, to the Trump administration's credit, they pushed out money to develop vaccines, but many Americans obviously died. Trump demonized the WHO over COVID policy in the world. I mean, there's been a long history, I mean, going back to Ronald Reagan, pulling the U.S. out of UNESCO in the 1980s, of kind of demonizing the United Nations and United Nations agencies. So, and I think that's likely to continue with Trump. He could well pull out of the WHO. He could well pull out of the UN High Commission on Refugees. I mean, more popular UN agencies like UNICEF, maybe not. U.S. wouldn't pull out of the General Assembly. But I think he probably doesn't know that agencies like the ILO exist. I mean, the WTO is another organization. Who knows I mean, given his ideas on trade, what he'd do with that. But a great question about the WHO. He might well, out of vindictiveness, some other.
Good evening. Thank you, first of all, to be here and to answer my question. We saw that populism was a huge means in the election campaign, not only in the US, but also in Europe. We see that a lot. So my question is, what do you think would be sustainable measures to better enlighten the population about politics and to prevent or rather weaken the effects of populism in the US, but also in Europe or all over the world, actually? Thank you.
Huge question there. Gosh, and what a question if we're ending on this to end on. Well, you know, it is a role that journalism used to play and education. Primary education, higher education. And we haven't talked about education policy other than my alluding to the fact that Donald Trump wants to get rid of the U.S. Department of Education. He supports school choice. He's anti-public schools in the United States. Or a lot of Republicans are anti-public schools. And there have been the attempts to ban books. There have been books banned in libraries and in public school libraries in America. You yeah, I mean, knowledge is power, and knowledge comes from education and journalism, really. And journalism, as we talked about earlier, traditional journalism has shriveled in the world. In America, as I say, more so than in France. I think things are doing better in France. I mean, you may not think so, but... and I think there's long been a greater respect for teachers here in France and for education. I mean, America used to respect teachers, used to respect higher education, but somehow that has become, many Americans vilify education. I mean, all the talk among many Republicans that teachers were grooming students, this term of, turning them into, homosexuals, turning them into LGBTQ people, little children. It's crazy. Where the idea that higher education, that, professors are all a bunch of left-wing, Marxists. Again, Trump called Kamala Harris a Marxist, hardly a Marxist. But yeah, the need for education, the need for good journalism. How can that turn around? I mean, one has to fight the good fight in the institutions that do exist. And thankfully, those institutions do continue to exist, but they're not as strong as I'd like to see them.
All right. Thank you, Professor Andrew Yarrow, for this great analysis. It was a pleasure to have you here tonight. We would also like to thank everyone who helped with the organization of this conference, Sabine Sauruger, Anne Belter-Hadik, le service communication, le service relations internationales, l'administration de Sciences Po, and our members. And finally, thank you to everyone who decided to join us tonight. November 14, wait a second. Sciences Po is organizing a second conference about the election, if you didn't have enough, with Pierre Martin, who is a political scientist and a membre associé au Laboratoire Pacte. Colibri is a student association that wants to link Sciences Po with the professional world. We strongly encourage you to follow us on Instagram, @colibri-IEPG, to learn more about our projects. Merci à tous et à tous.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. No, thank you. God. Hey, talking the election to death. Oh gosh, thank you. Oh gosh, I feel like we talked about every angle, every